Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. How lovely to see you. Sorry to interrupt the stimulating chatter that's already happening. Welcome to the Royal Society. Welcome to British Science Week. I'm Bettany Hughes. It is a great honour to be asked to host an event at the Royal Society. It is a double honour to be asked to work once again with the wonderful 1001 team. And it is a total delight to be asked to moderate this afternoon's panel, because I would venture to say that you have with you three of the most acute and indeed open minds currently working in academia, and incredibly appropriate because today we're going to be discussing 1001 cures, but in more broad and general terms. We're going to be talking about collaboration across time and space, no less. So let me just introduce you to our panel. We have on my right, on your left, Professor Peter Pormann, Professor of Classics and Greco-Arabic Studies at Manchester University. In the middle, Dr. Aarathi Prasad, biologist and writer working at UCL, whose latest book looks at, amongst other things, colonial intervention in Indian medicine, and is rather brilliantly called In the Bone Setter's Waiting Room, Travels Through Indian Medicine. And on my far right, Professor Peter Frankopan, Professor of Global History at Oxford University and Director of the Centre for Byzantine Studies, also at Oxford, and I'm sure probably most of you know, author of the global best-selling book, The Silk Roads, which I had the great pleasure to review. So as a tiny, tiny part of it becoming a bestseller, I like to think, because I really hugely liked it and it was very exciting. Just so you know what's going to happen, each of our panellists are going to speak very briefly, just for 5 minutes or so. We're then going to have a conversation up between ourselves and then open it to the floor. It's very much about a dialogue between us and you in the room. So please do think up your questions in advance. And we've got roving mics, so you will be heard. So, Peter, if you'd like to start. Thank you.
Yes, so thanks, Bethany. So this is the book, and I just thought I'll talk a little bit about the book and the purpose of the book and what we've tried to do with the book. So 1001 cures, what does this mean? Basically, within medieval Islamic society, we see a medical tradition flourishing, and flourishing to such an extent that it shone way beyond the borders of what one would call the Islamic empires. And the question then is, how did this tradition, how did this medical tradition come to be, how did it develop, and how did it influence other cultures, and how did it interact, for instance, with cultures in India or along the Silk routes or elsewhere. And in this book, we are trying to tell that story, beginning in a way with an act of the transfer of knowledge, the translation movement, where a lot of Greek medical texts, but also texts, so Indian medical text or Persian medical text, Syriac medical text, were translated into Arabic and formed, so to speak, the core theoretical background, the core of that medical tradition, which was then about to develop. And then we take the reader through a journey of different aspects of what happened later, because on the one hand, this story begins with an act of translation, of transmission of knowledge, but it doesn't end there. Sometimes people think all the Arabs did is transmit knowledge later to the Latin Middle Ages and it stopped there. No, it is a story of tradition and innovation, of transfer of knowledge and of change of knowledge, of innovation once again. And so we see this act of innovation in many different areas, be it in certain medical areas such as anatomy or surgery or pediatrics, or you name it, be it in institutional settings such as the Islamic hospital, or in the interaction between medicine and philosophy or medicine and literature. So we cover these different aspects basically in the book. And what it emerges is just this rich fabric of different medical minds working together. And here I want to emphasize this point of working together, because Arabic as a language was created in part through this translation movement. So Arabic became not just the language of some desert-dwelling Bedouins on the Arabian Peninsula, but it became an international language of science. it became the lingua franca of scientific discourse. And this language, Arabic, transcended country and creed. So in this book you will see, for instance, a manuscript from Paris which shows you a Judeo-Arabic version of Maimonides' abridgment of Galen's book on the method of healing. So now that's a bit of a mouthful, but what is important about here is that a Jewish author, Maimonides, who dies in 1204, wrote an Arabic abridgment of a Greek text, and he wrote this in Judeo-Arabic, in Hebrew letters, writing Arabic. So Jews or Christians would partake in this scientific discourse just as much as Muslims did. And also, we have people from different ethnic backgrounds. So we have a chapter here on Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria Aarathi, who dies in 925 and is probably the most innovative clinician of the medieval period. We have a chapter on Ibn Sina, Avicenna, who dies in 1037, and through his canon of medicine, Qanun fi Tibb, produced a work that influenced the fate and fortunes of countless generations of not just physicians and medical practitioners, but human beings in general, both East and West. And both these authors come from Persia, from a Persian background, although they wrote Arabic. So this shows you, this quick overview shows you already that we have different people from different backgrounds, and they can all partake in the same scientific discourse written in Arabic. And when in the following conversation I use the word sometimes Islamic medicine or Islamic science or any such expression, what I mean is that is shorthand for science that happened in the medieval Islamic world and that was so open onto the other, and that is what is so exciting about this story.
Brilliant, thank you. Aarathi.
So a few years ago, I heard that the Wellcome Collection, it's in Euston, was planning an exhibition on Indian medicine. It was supposed to be on street medicine. It was going to be held in Mumbai and probably also in London. And they were looking for a curator. I was just interested in what was going to be in it, so I spoke to them. And one of the heads of the public engagement there said, it occurred to me, why don't you write something about Indian medicine to go with it? And I said, well, what do you mean by Indian medicine? And he said, I don't know. And I felt exactly the same, because when someone said Indian medicine, the first thing I guess that popped into my head was indigenous. But what is indigenous? Because what I felt and what I also came to understand from speaking to people is that it's always a process of fusion and exchange of knowledge. So India has a long history of international exchanges in medicine, both with the West and with the East. We kind of probably know more about the 16th century Europeans going to India, the spices, and the Malabar coast. And so when Europeans went to India with their doctors, the doctors would have encountered diseases that they hadn't encountered before in Europe. And so they had to start dialoguing with the local practitioners. And asking them how they deal with it. And that led to things like, so the Portuguese doctor, Garcia da Horta, had an integrated hospital in Mumbai, but also one in Coimbra in Portugal. And about 100 years later, Henrik van Reed, who was the Dutch governor of the Malabar coast, wrote this impressive series, or collected a series of knowledge from local practitioners. And the introduction of that book was written in several languages, and that book carried information about herbal medicinal plants from India and was available in Amsterdam. Before that, of course, you had the Roman trade with India and the Malabar coast as well. And we know about black pepper in Berenike, is that how you say it, in Egypt? There were storage pots of black pepper found, which is a very valuable item. But they also found small amounts in archaeological studies of ginger and turmeric and rice and coconut and betel nut. What's interesting is that all of those are foods, right? We think of them as foods. Apparently, black pepper was the only one the Romans used as food, as spice. the ginger and the turmeric and the coconut and the rice were used as medicinal formulations for healing soldiers, etc. And then in about 140 BC, there was a shipwreck off the coast of Italy, Popolonia, and there was a medicine chest found in it. And miraculously, the medicine vials survived. And when they did chemical and genetic analysis, they found some of the herbs and plants, like hibiscus, like cardamom, probably very likely came from India. So we know that trade and exchange we know they were described as medicinal plants. Also, in about the 7th century, Ayurvedic doctors, so Indian surgeons, went to Damascus to lecture on Ayurvedic surgery. So for a period of time, there was a lot of exchanges of information with the European and the Eastern world. There was a period of time when the British were ruling India, however, when in medicine from Indian systems, this is primarily two professional systems of medicine in India, because there are many more that are folk traditions. And by professionalized, I mean there are textbooks and prescribed methods of learning, Ayurveda and Unani, were not meant to be taught as medicine. You could continue teaching them as Indology or as history, but not as medicine. And so then independence happened in around 1946, 47, 48. People started talking about this big question of how do we deliver health for all, which is still a big question. What do you do? Because you had medicine that you were using before, and then the British said, use this. So now you get to choose. What do you do? Do you go back to using what you had? Do you use what the British brought, or do you use some combination of the two? So a committee was set up by the first health secretary, and this committee recommended that an integrated system be used, and the government turned it down. And so the medicine that the British brought continued to be used in the mainstream. It wasn't until 1995 that a department of Ayush, which is Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, which is the Greco-Arabic system that developed through the Arabic world. The S is also Siddha and Sarigpa, which are a South Indian form related to Ayurveda, and Sarigpa originated in Tibet, I believe. And the H represents two European systems called homeopathy and naturopathy. So I was interested in that journey and where India is today. So in 2014, the current government made it a ministry, so it had elevated powers. So for the book, I thought, you couldn't really capture all of India ever. I wanted to visit a range of practitioners of the different forms of medicine around India. And I wanted to look at different socioeconomic groups as well to see what people used and why. So I went to many cities. I went to rural areas, tribal areas, slum areas, rich areas of Mumbai, for example. And I just want to tell you a story from Hyderabad, because in Hyderabad I met a few practitioners from the Unani tradition. And what struck me was really the blending that particularly the Unani doctors I found were particularly good at learning and fusing and blending from what they encountered. And they're still doing that now. So I went with my Urdu translator, Ramal Alvi, to first a guy called Khaja Mohd Azimuddin, who seems to be the last practitioner of a system called Tib-e-Nabawi, which I gather is based on the Hadith, and he uses herbs from Mecca. And when he can't get those, he substitutes them with herbs from the Ayurvedic or the Unani tradition. And then I met Hakim Sultan Rasul, who took us on a very exciting road trip through the sides of the roads and to forest areas to look at the kinds of plants there are. And he said, every plant is medicinal. We may not know what the use is. And he experiments with them to try to formulate new methods. So I always think of science, the Western science, because I'm a geneticist by training, as less of a rock and more of a river. It learns and it evolves and it changes. And I feel that's what these Unani doctors were doing. And the final family I visited was was Ghulam Muhyiddin, who was a bone setter. So I just wanted to read you very briefly a little bit about him. Sorry. So we pulled up to his clinic, which was like a shop front, and inside there were bandages and herbal balms, and it was a 41°C afternoon in Hyderabad, and there was a kind of lull in the afternoon. Ghulam Muhyiddin was the bone setter listed on the signboard with the letters BUMS. It's very funny. BUMS means Bachelor in Unani Medicine and Surgery. And he was junior only to his father, Hakim Ghulam Rasool. Aged 45 and having worked in the family clinic since he was a young teen, Muhyiddin now ran a series of bone-setting practices around Hyderabad. Called Luqman clinics, after an Ethiopian former slave said in the Quran to have been given a gift of healing, wisdom by God, the room we sat in was the oldest treatment center. The newest and largest was to be a hospital on the other side of town, a modern, custom-built structure with an outpatient department, as well as beds to accommodate inpatients. And the other clinics had better provision for using modern anesthetics, in which Muhyiddin had taken a postgraduate course. I wanted to integrate anesthetic injections to reduce severe pain. Muhyiddin told me how in his father's heyday until the 1970s, bone setters had the opportunity to become registered medical practitioners. In the days before Ayush existed as an official denomination, this meant that doctors unqualified in Western medicine could receive legal sanction to practice within their own systems, although they were not university educated. But many people didn't know how or didn't bother because, like my father, they had already been practicing independently and developing bone-setting techniques for many years. For Hakim Muhyiddin's family, many years actually meant 9 generations. His father's ancestors had come from Delhi as royal physicians in the entourage of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, who in 1687 besieged and destroyed Golconda, the fort about 7 miles from Hyderabad, then thought to be one of the most impregnable in South Asia. That particular siege lasted 8 months in a period of Indian history in which wars were a regular occurrence, with various battles fought between the Mughals, Persian, Indian, British, and other rivals over the years. Battles on the backs of horses, elephants, or on foot meant injuries to soldiers, injuries that needed skilled doctors working under the patronage of their rulers. The financial security and freedom the trusted Hakims were given allowed innovations in treatment to continue in the Ghulam family under the reign of the first Nizam, who took over from 1724 when Mughal rule collapsed. In the small clinic in which we sat, as well as from the medicinal supplies in the glass cabinets, there were 2 glass bowls of lape, a herbal balm, placed on the floor, which were also part of that tradition. One was white, the other yellow. I knew not to ask what was in them. They are often closely guarded family secrets, made with ingredients that vary between practitioners. Hakim Mustafa described the basics to me anyway. The formulations of these lapes are from generations back. The white is for massage, the yellow is good for pain. All homemade. We don't market them, so there's no certification. People come here with every orthopedic problem: fractures, rickets, osteoarthritis, cervical, neck problems. We open between 11 in the morning and 9 at night, but if any patient needs me for bone fractures or dislocations after that, we attend emergencies also. The small room in which we sat was where everything happened, but at 3 o'clock, the lull in the afternoon, during the hottest part of the afternoon, it was empty. I couldn't imagine the small space bulging with 60 to 70 patients I was told attended daily. There were less people coming in my father's days, Hakim Muhyiddin said. The population is higher now. Everyone comes. Now only maybe 10% speak Urdu, indicating an Islamic tradition. We set the bone in seconds, but generally we spend 15 to 20 minutes with each patient. It's not just the treatment that takes time. When someone breaks a bone, there is an imbalance of heat. Their lifestyle needs to be adjusted. They must have dietary restrictions. Hakim Mustafa spoke about the aklat, Unani humors, applying Unani theory to conditions relating to the bone. People with more bile also have more heat. They are given a different diet, but only until they get well. I thought back to the carrots, radishes, and onions that formed the ingredients of the tablets found on that ancient Greek shipwreck. For Unani, just as for Hippocratic doctors, medicine starts with what we eat and is intimately linked with diet.
Brilliant, thank you. I think you're all going to be given a copy of the book at some point this evening, and do have a look in there. There are some beautiful illustrations of the surgical instruments used to help with bone surgery. And the amazing thing is that these illustrations are originally in Islamic texts, and then they're then translated. I think you showed me one where there's a Hebrew description around.
We even have a Latin illustration of bone setting according to Avicenna, so it's a Latin translation that can be seen very early on in the book.
Very good. You have to deliver those illustrations to the bone setters that you discovered. Peter the Second, dare I say?
Yes, Peter the Great.
Peter the Great.
I'm sure it's my colleague Peter's favourite ruler as well. He insisted in his own lifetime that he was called the Great, which I think doesn't leave anything to chance. But yeah, so two Peter the Greats. Well, I should thank the organisers for inviting us. I have to say, I never thought that I'd ever be asked to come and speak at the Royal Society or be part of a panel, so it's a personal thrill to be here, partly because, as a historian, we sometimes we think of the world sometimes as dividing between the humanities and the sciences. And in all governments all around the world today, I see lots of people talking about STEM subjects and about the importance of science, technology, engineering and medicine. And we forget that it's important to provide a context. So I'm grateful to be invited here personally, but also it's important, I think, to be providing contexts for how and why, and to understand this wonderful book that I've been sent and have had a great pleasure of reading. All new books, all the panel know this, are a bit like, to use a medical theme, they are a bit like giving birth, which I've never had to do, but I've seen people do it, my wife, and they're always painful, but beautiful when it all comes through. So congratulations, Peter, in getting this done and getting all of your collaborators to write so brilliantly about different aspects of medicine and healthcare, and also of history. And I suppose my job today, or what I'd like to talk about, is always instinctively to try to understand how this happened in the first place. Why was it? What was it about the Islamic world in this period from 800 to 12, 1300 and onwards, actually, that made innovation, focus on science, healthcare so important? And Bettany very generously already plugged my book on the Silk Roads. But I'm extremely interested in about what it is that make people, exactly as Peter said, want to collaborate. And we're talking about the Silk Roads and realising how much more interconnected we are in the past, and of course, as we are in the present, that all sorts of things connect us together. One is our common human experience. One is the idea about trading goods from different parts of the world for medical reasons, for food, for stratification. Still today, furs and silks are very expensive and still show status. But I suppose the two most important things that if you're really rich, you want to pay for are number one, legal advice, and number two, medical care. And that is the same 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago as it is today. And I don't know if any of you are lawyers. The laws change, and they are not so easy to replicate all around the world, although the principles of law are they bind us all together as well. What should you do with an estate of someone who's died young? What should you do if someone hasn't left a will? What should you do between two neighbours fighting with each other? There are lots of things that lawyers can learn, but I suppose that healthcare and medicine is the exchange par excellence, because unlike faith, unlike money, unlike other sorts of exchanges, medical care and healthcare and medicine is something that we all want our fellow human beings to suffer as little as possible and to prosper. And so understanding how ideas about health, about optics, about the different types of cures that we look at, 100,001 cures, it's been that kind of winter. I think I've suffered from all of these in the last 6 months. I'm slightly squeamish, so I'm not that keen as Bettany is on looking at pictures of surgical instruments. But I think what's interesting is to see what is the context that provides this flourishing of the exchange of knowledge and information, which is not just about medical care. In the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, it's a time of profound cultural efflorescence. And we can very easily forget in the 21st century that once upon a time, there were other places that were centres of the world. if we'd been having this conversation 1,000 years ago, the Royal Society wouldn't have been where we have this discussion amongst the great and the good on the walls here and throughout the rest of the building. It would have been in other parts of the world, perhaps in Bukhara, perhaps in Baghdad, perhaps in Damascus, perhaps in Mosul, but almost certainly nowhere in Europe outside of Cordoba, I'd have thought. And that process of seeing, therefore, what drives those kinds of changes, what are the big themes that allow societies to flourish, and what do people do when you have the ability and resources to help people? And I suppose what this book talks of is a time of economic prosperity, because if you are an economic superpower, you can fund scholars to come and sit on a stage. You can fund surgeons to come and practice their surgery and to see what works. I mean, ideally, I quite often get asked, well, if you could live at any time in history, when would you like to live? And I'd say the only two things I'd insist on is I would never want to come back poor, and I probably, on balance, half the audience will probably hiss at me, wouldn't want to come back as a woman, because the dice are loaded against you very heavily for both. And in fact, today, it's one of the things that we should celebrate, perhaps, being either woman or poor. Our lot is better than probably most other times in history. But at the same time, if I'd come back 1,000 years ago, I'd want to have been alive in a global capital, which would have meant Baghdad, maybe Constantinople, maybe Xi'an, maybe southern India, where rulers used their wealth to advance knowledge. And scholarship, medicine particularly, require donors. And as Peter said, they require collaborators. I mean, it's surprising, in fact, just us four on this panel, that we're speaking English, because that wouldn't be my first language, I suspect. Maybe not Peter's either, and so on. So the fact that English binds us all together, it's a very appropriate parallel, actually, today, that all four of us from different backgrounds, all four of us from different... I'm a lot older than all of you, I'm afraid. But, you know, we find a way of finding how do we share knowledge. And as our peers who appear in this book would have very quickly picked us up on, they would have asked us to explain exactly what does medicine mean, exactly what does healthcare mean. And these kinds of questions you find repeatedly in these texts. What do words mean? And philosophy, law, semantics, philology all go hand in hand with definitions. If you go to see your doctor and you say, my back's sore, working out exactly what your back means and what sore means is potentially the difference between operated on and not being operated on. So this book is important, and understanding our past, as you may know, I think is hugely important. The way in which we've collaborated, the way in which we've tried to learn from each other, and medicine in this period where places like Baghdad and Cordoba, Fustat, Cairo, Damascus, Bukhara, Isfahan led the world in so many ways that it's important to remember how we collaborated, not just from different ethnic backgrounds, but different religious backgrounds too, because by and large, societies that are prosperous tend to be self-confident, and they tend to welcome clever people from any background. I couldn't care less where my surgeon comes from, what their background is, what their ethnicity is, what their first language is. I just want the best healthcare, and those who are wealthy enough to go private will always choose to have the best that they can have from anywhere in the world. And I think that this is an important lesson. Of course, when we look back at the implications of medicine and healthcare in the past, we can see that it is responsible for all sorts of very familiar ideas, like fake news. I was reading in preparation for this some of those translations from the Greek texts. The Greeks and the Romans, well, particularly the Greeks, were highly revered by the Arabs as being not just good scientists and mathematicians, but the way that they worked through problems. But they didn't always get it right. So I'll just have a quick look around the audience today. Yeah, so one of the things you find in a couple of 10th century texts are men who have their hair down to their shoulders. I can't see any here today, luckily, but there is somebody at the back. Well, okay. Well, I mean, luckily this is probably wrong from Gale and Pormann and from all the from the Arabic history, medical guides. It's a sign, I'm afraid to say, of recklessness, which may be true. Okay, well then we haven't lost friends. Anyone with a fine voice, I'm afraid I'm not one of them, is stupid and has no charisma. But my favourite one, I would pull my shirt open at this point, but my microphone is connected through it to show that I do not have abundant chest hair, which, to judge from many of the compendia from this period, are clear medical signs of lack of any understanding or empathy, brutishness, and most absurd of all, probably, a profound love of tyranny. Which I can point you in lots of different directions in the world to countries where you can find that if you like it. But I think this process of understanding how medicine opened up gateways for collaboration, for scholarship. It's a beautiful way that Aarathi put it. It's not a rock, it's a river. Science as well as history. And my favourite text, in fact, as Bettany knows, written in the 12th century by a woman, talks about time flowing like a river. It never stands still. It always washes away the names. And all of these great scholars who at the time were, they didn't have the internet, but they were the most famous scholars in the world. Their names have been lost to generations of scholars, of practitioners and young people. And it's important to keep their memory alive and the context in which they prospered. So I'm delighted to be here to talk about the history, I suppose, and the context for how these how civilizations flourish and prosper, how they learn from all sources, from South Asia, from China, from Europe, and try to do the best that they can, because in this divided world we live in, it's sometimes hard to remember that barriers are things that we put up amongst ourselves. And so the more in which scholarship is funded, the more that you have specialists who can produce books like this and collaborators who work with Peter to produce the magnificent book, the better. But I don't know whether, I'm sure no one's going to disagree with that.
No.
I hope.
And I mean, what this book does is obviously celebrate those moments when collaboration works, when it's nourished and when it flourishes. I just wanted to ask all of you, from your research, what is the obverse of that? From when you've looked at your specialist areas, when are the moments that we shrink from one another, when we etilate our experiences, when we diminish the possibility of collaboration? Because it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, to have some kind of a rubric that that we know what that is, and when we see it coming, we can all do our best to head that off at the pass. Peter, I don't know if you've thought about that at all.
Well, thought, yes, but I think there's not just one answer to it, because, I mean, even in this, I just designated this period of time as one of collaboration, and generally speaking, of course, that's true. But you had a caliph, for instance, like the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim bi Amrillah, who lives in the early 11th century, organized pogroms against Christians. You have people who, in the 15th century, like there's this wonderful word, like where they basically they break all the wine bottles and get rid of all the wine in a fit of basically extremism. And so these things happen, and sometimes I want to say, okay, it's maybe economic deprivation, or try to find one of these labels that would explain this. But it happens at different moments in history and for different reasons. And so I think, so this is a very good question to which I don't have the answer, but I think there's more than one reason, and unfortunately it does happen from time to time, and sometimes even under pressure science flourishes, as we know. So it's not just that prosperity generates science. We were just talking with the president of the Royal Society, and that's one of the points he made, that at times under pressure, even though there's not such great prosperity or such goodwill towards one another, science can flourish. So difficult question. I'm not sure I have the answer.
No.
At the time, in the 16th century, when Europeans went to India, you could argue that Western medicine wasn't so different in terms of the ideas of balance and humours and the connection between mind and body and environment. And even though, the humours can sound silly, but it was more scientific than thinking, trying to find a causation for disease rather than superstition that you stepped on a shadow or someone put the evil eye on you, etc. But even though that was the general idea in the Western world until scarily recently, there were people who objected to it. So I think William Harvey challenged the idea of humours. Now, the same thing happened in India. Ayurveda was criticised by practitioners at about the same time. There was an Ayurvedic Vaidya doctor who considered the humours, he said, as the babbling of lunatics. And then when the British stopped the teaching of medicine, Indian medicine and Unani medicine in India, it was in the mid-19th century. So Western medicine developed a lot at that period. And an Ayurvedic doctor said to me, this prevented the development of Ayurveda and Unani along those same modern scientific lines because a stop was put to it. And had it been allowed that there could have been research and development in a parallel fashion, it may have been today where Western medicine is now. And so that, I guess, was a political move. Maybe the idea was that Unani was linked to Islam and Ayurveda to Hinduism, so if the British had to rule with Christianity, maybe that was one of the ideas behind it. But it certainly stopped the potential for innovation.
I'd have thought that there is, humanities are not expensive to fund. And it's absolutely right, Peter's exactly right, and the President of the Royal Society was here. Of course, there can be, under pressure, great works, and particularly, and we know that in art and music and literature, some of the most glorious flourishings in those come at moments, for example, in the 1920s in the Soviet Union and in Western Europe too. But it's very difficult if you're running a laboratory that requires kit worth millions of pounds if your funding gets cut. So it's very hard in the sciences to make advances, particularly in the modern world, where the technology that's required is so substantial. So the withdrawal of funding, for whatever reason, obviously causes a problem. And typically states who go to war or have fragile borders or have internal problems tend to withdraw, have to reallocate their resources to other things, and particularly...
Well, the war's always been a good way of innovating.
Well, particularly with technology, absolutely. I think that there is a second problem, which is about, in a funny way, it's about specialisms. We as scholars, we advance our subjects by taking small grains and moving them forward. And I think, having written about big things, and you've done that too, Bettany, it's a real challenge to cover long periods, to cover big regions, to do things that require some bravery, because it's much safer. It'd be much safer for me to write things about the period I'm most interested in actually is between 1081 and 1098, right? If I had my choice, I'd be very happy writing about that and producing, hopefully, quite interesting things. It's quite hard to jump out. And that's certainly true in the sciences too, that because you are working on something very specific, it's very hard to stand back and see everything. And one of the things that's most interesting about these texts, like the Canon of Medicine that Ibn Sina did, is that idea that there is a full topic, that you can and should try to understand the whole. We should try to understand history. We should try to understand what should a 18 or 80-year-old know about the past. What should we know about art? Like Civilizations is trying to do on the TV at the moment, that takes these boundaries away. And I think specialisms can be problematic in terms of driving people into narrow streams without ever connecting into one river. But I think the single most important challenge to advancement of scholarship in the sciences, medicine, and so on, both in other regions and other periods, and today, are boneheadedly stupid politicians. And we don't have a monopoly on that. No country has a monopoly on politicians who make bad decisions. It's always difficult if you're running a state day to day and worrying about criticism or managing your court or your parliament or whatever it is. It's very hard to find time to read. And one of the challenges that our political class, if I can call them that, find is that how do they get educated? And you either have to have a fantastic education system so that by the time they leave school, college, university, they're well enough formed to know what kind of questions to look at and to know what kind of problems there are, or they've got to be encouraged constantly, or have people around them who are constantly mopping up information. And one of the things that I've been most surprised by, I think, going around the world a lot in the last few years, is that there are some global leaders who really do spend time reading. They really do spend time thinking, and we all know thinking and reading and so on doesn't mean you're right. And I know lots of colleagues who spend lots of time reading and writing, and they can't come up with good ideas either. So, but at least you're trying. And I suppose a bit like medicine, if you might be able to solve it if you see someone with an injury and you've got no medical back. All of us will have been on an aeroplane when they call for a doctor and so on. And if there's no one puts their hand up, we've all watched Casualty, we've all seen programs. It's better than nothing, but at the same time, a body of knowledge is important. And civilizations, societies, cultures, countries that flourish recognize that. And when that comes under pressure for political causes, sometimes a good reason and so on, then the building gives way very quickly.
I think that's exactly as you say, that obsession with the day-to-day, the quotidian, is the enemy of progress, isn't it? That we can be so obsessed with what is in front of us, we forget to do something more fundamental, which a lot of these scientists and researchers did. If you could look right back to the story of civilization, so we're talking, 2,500 years ago, when we start to live together in cities, the great philosophers of Socrates, the Buddha, Confucius, all wrestle with this problem, and they all work out that it's very difficult to live together. So we have to access some notion of, Buddha calls it love, Socrates calls it love, Confucius calls it human-heartedness, that you have to have a base point of human-heartedness before you deal with those particular problems that are presented.
Just to sort of, I won't say anything more. I mean, that's why you could equally write a book about mirrors for princes. I'm not the first person who's come up with this idea that the rulers make bad decisions because they're ignorant. There is a huge school of writing in Arabic, in Persian, in Turkic, in Byzantine Greek, in the European world, all over India, China, about what it is that a ruler needs to do, learn, and know. And that's something for all sorts of reasons that doesn't really exist anymore. What should our Prime Minister? We all want the country to prosper, right? We all want all countries to prosper. But in this moment of crisis where we've got one president, I'm not going to give his name, who might press a red button at any time, big fat red button, another one who might press a small red button, trade wars kicking off and so on, what is the body of knowledge rather than gut instinct? And, any classical scholar, any medieval scholar, whichever part of the world that was literate would say that forming decisions based on your emotions is what animals do, and what humans need to do is to study, and scholarship has value.
Rational inquiry.
The process of drug discovery is incredibly detailed and difficult, and what the practitioners I met in India, so now the government's funding research centres that are using modern methodologies, so genetic and chemical analysis, to look at old formulations. So a lot of people say, you know what, we've had these treatments for 5,000 years. We know they work. We just don't know how they work. So we don't know the biological mechanisms and physiological mechanisms through which they work. So we should test them. There are a lot of scientists who are against that, which I find odd. They're against testing things that other people use because it's what we call here complementary and alternative medicine. These medicines have active chemical ingredients in them, so it stands to reason that there's something that works. But there's a blockage in the sort of academic front as well. In the same way that now we are talking more about social prescribing in medicine, so letting people access libraries and books and museums and music and art. There are people who think that's bonkers too, but there's nothing wrong with doing the research. The reason the Indian government decided to go with British medicine and not an integrated system was because they said the bases were too fundamentally different. But there are sort of clinical studies and ways that you can find to investigate things with different bases. Some people are just too pig-headed to think that there's anything in that, but they should be collaborating.
And one of the things actually that's in the book, which you kind of know of, but then it's so fascinating to read in detail about, is the kind of, as you're saying, the brilliant faith in body and mind both mattering when you physic, so that in a lot of the Islamic hospitals, music was just prescribed as part of the cure. And we're talking 1,000 years ago that this was something which was incredibly popular, as you know, right the way through. Our dear Florence Nightingale, when she nursed during the Crimean War, was so impressed by the way she was horrified by the Brits were treating their soldiers, were delighted to find out how people were being treated in the hospitals in Istanbul, because music was being played often to kind of both to lower their pain levels, which we now know music does, and also just to physic their soul. So I don't know, Peter, if you want to say, because there's a beautiful chapter just on that in the book.
But I mean, maybe I can just pick up on one point made by Aarathi. So, and this is one of medical epistemology. How do we know that drugs work? I mean, that is a very old question. I mean, it already pops up in certain Hippocratic treatises, not least on ancient medicine, and I'm not going to go into this. It is famously discussed by Galen in his treatise on the sects for beginners. So a very basic textbook, simply asking the question, how do we know, how can we test drugs? And Galen has a distinction into three sects, three schools of medicine. One is the Methodist, and I'm not going to talk about this here, but then the other two are the empiricists and the rationalists. So the empiricists say, basically, the human body is so complex and so complicated that we can never know its inner workings. So therefore, when we deal with cures, we should limit ourselves to looking at what we have observed ourselves, what other people have reported, and then sometimes we need to do what they call transfer, metabasis to homoio as to homoion. So basically something similar to something similar. So if a cream works on my arm, it might also work on my leg, or if a lemon cures me, it might also be a lime. So this is one way of looking at things. Then the other way is the rationalists say, no, we need to understand the inner workings of the body. We need to find out what's happening, and only then can we really know which cures work and which aren't. And this debate, which basically goes back to antiquity, is continuous. And one of the areas where we find innovation is this area of medical epistemology. So, for instance, Aarathi, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria Aarathi, my favorite author, my favorite doctor from the Middle Ages, he once does an experiment where he bleeds people suffering what probably is meningitis, and he uses a control group, for instance, in order to find out whether or not the bleeding works or does not work. Now, obviously, bloodletting is not nowadays recognized as a cure for meningitis, and I think there are some doctors here in the audience that they would probably not perform it if they are faced with that disease. But this is in a way irrelevant. What is important is that there are methodological areas where progress is made, just as there's made practical progress, and that is what is so fascinating, and in a way plays into this question of how do we know what works? Can we still use, for instance, former recipes inherited from the Unani tradition or not? I mean, if they work, why should we not use them? And modern medicine often has this chimera, the placebo effect, which hides much more than it really reveals. But this is for me one area which is fascinating. And just very briefly to come back to your body-mind interaction. So Galen came up with this idea of the 6 non-naturals. So factors we have heard about the humors called akhlad in Arabic and in the Unani medicine, humoi in Greek. And there are these 4 humors, but there are also 6 non-naturals. So sleep and wakefulness, or food, drink, your environment, these are all aspects. And one of these aspects, of course, is how you feel. And that makes such a difference for so many conditions. And so it is very, very interesting to see how this medical tradition further develops this and comes up with all sorts of cures, and sometimes in interesting ways. For instance, there's one disease, melancholy, which is caused by an excess of black bile, and it has a huge history, which is so fascinating, about which we can't talk really now, both East and West. But one of the cures that is already advocated in antiquity, and which is then which Avicenna, for instance, continues to advocate, is to improve the mood of the patient by, for instance, drinking wine or by listening to music, tarab. So these, ladha wa tarab is like one phrase that is used in one Arabic source. So pleasure and song, and so these things play a role, and they are important, and they continue. And if you want to read more about it, there's the chapter by Pauline Coetzee about it.
What do you think? What role does faith play in the substantiation and the support of medicine? Because it's very clear that in the Islamic system there's a notion of permanent charity, and that's one of the reasons that hospitals are founded. Obviously it's a part of a religious law that people should be supported and helped within the community. And I know that, Peter, for your work in Constantinople, in Byzantine, in Christian Constantinople, there's an explosion of hospitals and hospices and maternity wards and leprosy wards after a few years after Constantine the Great's conversion. But it does feel that there is a connection between between belief and then putting your belief into action.
Yes, there certainly is, especially if you look at the institutional framework. So you mentioned the hospital. it's very strange. There's like this slight contradiction. On the one hand, I think that Islamic hospitals are something very different from earlier Byzantine hospitals in that the medicine practice there is not religious. What do I mean by that? The practitioners who work there, at least when we talk about 9th and 10th century Baghdad, are Muslim, Christians, Jews. It doesn't really matter. We have reports about Muslims, Christian, Jews, and others as patients in these hospitals. And more importantly, the scientific discourse, that's the Greek discourse of humoral pathology, of these 4 humors, the 6 non-naturals, what we've already mentioned. So it's a discourse that people from different communities can partake in. So on the one hand, it's not religious, but on the other hand, of course, it is, because these hospitals are often endowed in Islamic law. It's called waqf awqaf, so they are pious institutions supported. So it's basically a way to protect your money from the taxman, So you give it to charity and you set this up. I mean, obviously, it also earns you brownie points for the afterlife, but sometimes economy and economic leanings and interests play a role. So this institution then is animated by Islamic charity and is so important. It becomes something very different because the elite medicine moves into these hospitals. So again, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria Aarathi is associated with hospitals both in Baghdad and in his hometown of Farai, basically nowadays part of Tehran. And he is like one of the top doctors. And he says, students should study in these hospitals. Why should they study in these hospitals? Because on the one hand, they see loads of cases, and then this allows you basically to make statistical observations. And he himself makes some statistical observations about cases involving hundreds of patients. And on the other hand, you can see rare cases. So there are some diseases that are incredibly rare and that you would only see if you work in a hospital, because elsewhere you don't come across that stuff. So basically, there's this Christian author, Sa'd ibn al-Hassan, who writes this work on medical deontology called At-Tashwiq At-Tibbi, inspiring a yearning for medicine, if that's like a translation. And he says these hospitals, they're great places to learn medicine. People should study there. And so these hospitals become kind of teaching hospitals, although this is an anachronistic term. They're places of medical research, and they become something else. And at the base of that is, in a way, Islamic charity, is zakat or whatever you want to call it. And that is so interesting. So there's like this dichotomy. On the one hand, inclusive scientific discourse. On the other hand, almsgiving and charity.
I'm going to open it to the floor to have a think about your questions, but just what about the parallels of Constantinople?
I was going to talk about how the spread of medicine and religion go very closely hand in hand. So we find lots of accounts, for example, I think my favourite 10th century account by Ibn Fadlan, who describes how a ruler in what's called Volga Bulgaria, which is now sort of the northern part of Russia, has a ruler who adopts Islam, and Ibn Fadlan goes to go and meet him to go and find out who he is and how does he fit in, and first question he says is, how come you're Muslim here? And he says, well, we had a holy man here and the leader fell ill and he cured him, and so we thought we should all become Muslim as a result. And these are all. I mean, these medical texts, for what it's worth, it's very boring. But they are also works of literature. We need to be careful how we read these, that we don't just take them as gospel fact and so on. And a good way of showing that, I suppose, is that we've got lots of 10th century English texts that talk about these kinds of medical treatments. And if you're living in England in the 10th century, you don't have access to pepper or ginger. You're just writing this all down, going, if you're ill, this is what you should take. But the chance of you actually having any of the materials, absolutely zero. But that spread of connectivity that bring trade, that spread religions, that spread knowledge. The Nestorian Christians who head eastwards into the Eastern Christian Church spread very well into all across Asia, all across what's now Iraq, Iran, and Central Asia, and then into China. And in China, they become very famous Nestorians, not particularly as eye specialists, but also because they have been Christian. Incense is important, and incense we know has purgative properties. But also, it turns out if you're a Christian and there's someone who's dying and you say you're going to live again, that's very persuasive. So religion and medicine and so on go hand in hand, and partly because in all periods, all times, people who are literate, I mean, until the modern world, people who are literate are often trained to read the Quran or the Sanskrit texts or the Bible or so on. So knowledge is often quite closely aligned between faith and medicine. These things go in different ways, and across the steppes of Central Asia, you find, again, reports in the 9th and 10th centuries of Christian pilgrim or visitors who find whole tribes who have a cross tattooed into their head. And it turns out that, again, the same process, that somebody influential, important has fallen ill, and an outsider who was Christian cured them, and in this particular case didn't try to convert them. They all thought, well, we should just, that saves us. Next time we're ill, he talked about the cross, so let's all get it tattooed. And so generations later, there they are being tattooed. So I think that connection of faith and healthcare they're interesting things of looking at, I think.
Yeah. Any questions from the floor? We've got a few minutes. We're having music at 6:15. Yes. So, lady raising her hand. There are roving microphones. If you could, there's a yes, lady just one in. Thank you. Questions rather than statements would be wonderful.
Okay. Thank you very much for whatever you presented. My question is for Peter Pormann. Regarding music. Regarding music, surely music was not in this Bimaristan just for its entertainment. Have you come across any manuscript or anything showing how music affected the patients? Something to do with their healing and releasing hormones or whatever in that regard? Thank you.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I mean, we've already touched on this. Music is one of the things that improves your mood. Your mood is one of the things, one of the 6 known naturals, and so there are case histories. There are, in Avicenna's canon, in Aarazi's case history, you find repeated mention of people playing certain moods, certain tunes, uplifting, soft tunes that help cure people. And so we have, on the one hand, case histories. On the other hand, we have this discussed in the theoretical literature. So there's quite a bit of that. And yes, so.
And I think, again, just the doctors in the room will know this is very interesting work at the moment about music and, as we were saying, lowering the pain threshold. You probably know that the word harmony comes from the same root as arm, so it's a joining. And it seems as though the playing of music just encourages our systems to physically be in harmony so that we have the best chance to fight against either an infection or the symptoms of pain. So, as we said, what's fascinating is they were onto it 1,000 years ago, and we're
the angriest anybody's ever been with me in my entire life was when my wife went to hospital to give birth, and we had our pregnancy plan, like all, and these days everyone talks about what do you like, and halfway through her contractions, I said to her, "Would it help if I put on some Mozart?" And I've never seen anybody look that angry. I should have probably just done it and it would have been fine.
Yes, exactly. I don't think the child might have been taken elsewhere if we'd done that. Yes, there's a gentleman at the front there and then a gentleman at the back with a blue tie.
If I could ask that in the expansion in North Africa of Islam, I've often read that Islamic families had Christian doctors within their family unit. Is that a true statement? Was it such that there was sharing of information like that, or were Christian doctors used in that way?
So, you ask about North Africa. I'll take this question slightly broader. I start with an anecdote by Al-Jahiz. Al-Jahiz, a great literary author, wrote a book of Mises, book of Mises, Kitab al-Bukhala. And in this book, he tells the story of one doctor, a Muslim doctor, and his friend sees him, and his name is Asad al-Jani. Yeah? So, and his friend asks him, "What's going on? Disease is rampant. People are dying left, right, and center. Why are you so miserable? You should be able to have very good business." And this poor Assad says, yeah, would that were true. But I wear an Arab dress, and I speak with an Arab accent. And there are these people, the Bukhtishu and others, basically, and they get all the patients. So basically, at his, in his day, let's say, the late 8th, 9th, early 9th century, the majority of doctors probably were Christian and Jewish, and there was certainly this idea. So you could kind of make fun of a Muslim doctor for thinking that all his competition is Christian and Jewish, and they are so much better at getting all the custom. So that changes over time. I mean, obviously, medicine is taught, and then there might be fewer doctors, so that the profession might no longer be dominated by Jews and Christians, but there certainly were many Jews and Christians. And we know, for instance, of some doctors who are Muslim, who have Christian pupils or apprentices or whatever you want to call it, and vice versa. So there's a lot of, it's very, well, it's very inclusive. It's not very sectarian, if you see what I mean, that medical tradition as it presents itself. Now, in North Africa, if we talk about the 10th, 11th, 12th century, I don't think, I mean, so statistical evidence obviously is difficult because we don't have registers of doctors, but I think it's fair to say that the majority of Christians, so the majorities of doctors are no longer Christian, but there were certainly some who are around. And what is so wonderful, once again, is that the people can interact with each other. And I'll just give you one final example. There's Ibn Ridwan and Ibn Butlan, one a Christian, the other a Muslim, one in Baghdad, the other in Cairo, who have this exchange of letters, and they discuss the question whether the egg or the chick that comes out of the egg is hotter. I mean, it's not like a fundamental question of existential importance to us, but it was like hotly debated in terms of human pathology, and hot and cold are two of the four cardinal qualities, so it made sense to discuss this. And they go at each other. They are very fierce, and one calls the other, you're not a tabib, you're not a doctor, you're just a mutatabib, kind of, you're just a medical practitioner. And all sorts of abuse goes on, but never religious. So you see, like, there's no, in that scientific exchange, there's no denigrating the other because of the religion. I'm not saying it never happened, but like, generally speaking, there's like this inclusive climate, and that makes it so interesting. So, short answer: in North Africa, later on, probably the majority were not Christians, but earlier on in Baghdad, the majority probably were Christians. But what is interesting is this inclusive nature of the medical discourse, in which all can partake.
Can you just elaborate on whether the religion made a difference to the type of medicine they were practicing?
I think hardly. No. So the theoretical medicine was. So this is it. So I say this again. I said it earlier on. So this humoral pathology, this idea of the four humors, the six non-naturals, and all that comes with it, that's inherited from the Greeks, and it's not specific to Christians or Jews or Muslims or Zoroastrians or you name it, Sabians and pagans. You know, we have we have them. They're part of that story. And so because of that, because it transcends these different religions, it becomes kind of a discourse in which all can partake. And Arabic becomes the language in which this happens, because through the translation movement, Arabic advances into a language capable of expressing incredibly complex philosophical, mathematical, medical things. And the legacy of that translation movement we see even today. So if you take a word like nadharia, theory, you know, the way it's formed has to do with theorein. Nadhara means to see. So I mean, I could go on. I mean, I don't want to take too much time, but basically, yes. So that's part of the beauty of this culture.
Although we are told that there are some Muslim doctors thought that Christian doctors basically used the equivalent of sledgehammers. They sort of said they were very unprecise, and Richard the Lionheart, of course, famously chose to have an Islamic doctor.
So can I just come in there? So there's this, just very briefly, is that okay?
Absolutely, yes.
Just I'll be one second. So this goes back to a story in Ibn al-Munqidh, who lives during the Crusades, and who gives these two accounts of like a Frankish physician and another Christian physician brought up in the Islamic tradition. And the Frankish physician kind of cuts off the leg and the patient dies. But that is basically that's a caricature. So we shouldn't take this as gospel. Larry Conrad wrote on this, so just
no,
sorry.
absolutely. Gentlemen, the time. I think there's a lady behind. Did you want to ask a question as well? Just very briefly, because we've got some music to come in 5 minutes.
I'll try to be brief. Thank you for a great discussion. My question has to do with the discussion of a relationship of body and mind. So having read some of the history of Islamic and non-Islamic Eastern medicine and practice medicine in the West, in the US mostly, there's a great emphasis on that relationship, body-mind in the East. There's very little, the focus in the Western medicine on evidence-based medicine. And now suddenly we see the East running after evidence-based medicine, the West running after a relationship of body and mind, talking about patient experience, patient-focused care, but all these other things, music therapy, and the thing that goes with body and mind issue. What prevented that interaction to happen for the last 1,000 years? Why is it happening now, not 500 years ago?
It might be mechanistic. I mean, what on earth is the mechanism whereby something that happens to... Still, psychiatrists in Mumbai don't accept things like gender-based violence as a reason why women get depressed and have anxiety. They're hardcore psychiatrists, they medicate. And you're right, now we're seeing mindfulness everywhere and other places going the other way. But it might just be, how does it work? I mean, now we have electrodes and neuroscientific and fMRIs, and we can measure those things. Maybe that's why we're seeing that it's more believable, that things are happening that we couldn't detect. So much about detection. I mean, before you had glass and lenses, you couldn't see. You couldn't see pathological, bacteria and viruses, and we see, we believe, and maybe.
Can I just pick up on one thing?
Yes, do pick up. Did that lady? Did you want to ask a question? Just wait for the microphone, and then pick up, just so that she gets.
So it was just an observation actually, and it was partly addressed by Aarathi, in the sense that if, for example, in this day and age, when we go to a doctor to find a cure, we wouldn't. It wouldn't occur to us to question whether they're Christian, Muslim, Jew. And I just wonder if society has changed so much. Ultimately, it's about going to someone who can fix you when you're unwell, and it's about results that determine whether or not you're going to approach somebody. I can't imagine if there were a body of doctors in a particular area who were all trained in the same way, that question would ever arise. And it surprises me that we're kind of... we're almost tagging it in hindsight, in history, that these were Christians and these were Jews. Ultimately, they're doctors and they're there to serve to provide a service. The other thought that occurred to me was that you've reflected on the fact that religion and medicine are very closely related. And it occurs to me that ultimately, if you're unwell, particularly if you're seriously unwell, you think about the afterlife and what's going to happen to you after you're dead. And I think that the root of that, the connection between medicine and religion, isn't so surprising then, if you think about it as your relationship with managing what you're going to do if you don't survive. And ultimately, I think that I'm not sure if that's reflected. So we talk about... It bothers me that we kind of are almost compartmentalizing medicine historically into, the religious factions, when actually I suspect it probably wasn't the case. It was probably very similar to religion as it is now.
Fascinating observation. I think, do you mind if we just have two really, really brief, you wanted to come back, and then we've got the gentleman at the back with the long hair who recklessly is going to ask the last question of the session, only because we started slightly late, and so we just want to allow time for the musicians. So if you just both would quickly like to, just very briefly.
No.
You're waiting for the reckless questioner.
So I wanted to say something about, because I hear this word evidence-based medicine. So I hate this word, because medicine was evidence-based in antiquity, and this here, that's evidence-based medicine. I talked about medical epistemology, the rules of how you can know that a drug works or not. So this is based on evidence. So the notion of what constitutes evidence obviously has changed over time. But they were doing evidence, and so don't use the word evidence-based medicine in counter-distinction to this tradition, because this is just as much evidence-based as our modern medicine.
Yeah, anecdote is a form of evidence, just the lowest
for.
Sure, but I mean, like, so reports, of course, are important. If people report that something works, then you need to investigate it. So that's part of like this, these empiricists and so on and so forth. So I mean, that's just what I wanted to say. Yeah.
Did you want to? Yeah.
I think it is valid to talk about religion in medicine. I've been to many discussions where, I think doctors can make decisions choose not to make decisions on moral grounds. I've had many cases in abortions, in treating gay people, in giving the contraceptive pill. The Royal College of Pharmacologists allow pharmacists to take those decisions and not give the morning after pill in boots, because they don't believe in it. So it's a valid discussion. But there are doctors from different religions who say, when I'm in the hospital, I'm a doctor. When I'm at home, I'm a practicing whatever. But also I would say I think medicine is a great tool of diplomacy and a great neutral area as well, because you see this in India that everyone goes to everything. It doesn't matter what background they're from. And a Unani doctor said, because I went to him thinking that I'd see him doing pulse measurements and looking at urine and stool, and he said, no, when my patients come here, they tell me their blood pressure reading and their blood sugar reading, and I have a blood pressure meter, and I check blood sugar, because these tools don't belong to anyone. These are medical tools, and I will use whatever I can to make my patients better.
It's doing exactly what Peter was saying, of not erecting fake boundaries and walls.
Yeah, and I think it's just the lady's question. I mean, that's exactly what we do. The problem is that we have created a history that is profoundly Eurocentric. I mean, I would say that we have excluded other parts of the world, other cultures, and so exactly right. Why would anybody say, did people really have Jewish doctors or Christian doctors? By and large, people get on with each other. The problem is how we've told the past and told the story of history has to invert all of that so that anybody is not like us or not like Europeans. It's a blank slate. So there's a process, I think, having to work through these kinds of questions and be tolerant with them, because other parts of the world outside, I mean, even parts of Europe, we've got no idea about Poland or Hungary or Finland or the Balkans, but, we have this very narrow world where medicine in our recent experience the last 300 or 400 years is Western European and American, and that world, never existed before, and in fact it didn't exist at the time as well.
Gentleman at the back.
I think those three answers just answered half my question, because wonderful answers. That the notion of evidence in the secular, Eurocentric, secularized, scientific world, based on the notion of a certitude of a priest-like caste of doctors, has been heavily challenged in the last 50 years. The side effects in pharmaceutical industry, surgery being rather brutish, and so forth. So I think the methodological aspect of approach is much more scientific, just not micro or nano or industrialized, as we've seen. And that should be understood as it's not medieval necessarily for the Muslim world. It wasn't a medieval age for us. It was an enlightened age. And so the anthropological, methodological aspects. And I think we live in a time, and my question is, concerning the Silk Roads, Asia, and evidence, where the Chinese government is heavily investing with trillions in their own economy, let alone the Silk Roads, in medicine, modern medicine as it's called, and preserving and reviving Chinese medicine. And I think there may be a knock-on effect throughout all of Asia, especially, with the medicines that haven't died out. Unani, Ayurveda, in Indonesia, Thailand, there could be a massive sort of investment in fusing the evidence that is not collated or organized in a modern fashion and modern techniques. And we could be on the cusp of an age of revival of loads of Eastern medicines which are presentable to the world.
It's not a very reckless question at all, so I'm pleased you confirmed that these accounts are all quite wrong. But I think that's exactly right. I think that those of you who work as medical practitioners, doctors, and in the research side know that in sciences and medicine, just like in fact in history, what big data can do and how we can apply, you call it evidence-based, anyway, is going to transform these kinds of things. And as Aarathi said, that people are willing to try. Personally, I was reading this morning about viper skin, that you should use that as a cure for hemorrhoids. But you need to have people who are prepared to have that done to them to check whether that works, right? And maybe that's a shorter list than normal. But I think that process of trying to work out what is there in medicines, particularly of indigenous peoples. I do a bit of work with that and support Survival International, which is very keen to protect the intellectual property of tribes people who live all over the world, who use the flora and fauna of their own environments to treat illnesses. And we don't understand how any of that works a lot of the time. And then when we do, the big pharma comes in, takes it away from them, kicks them off the land, or pays the government to kick them off the land, and so on. So I think that there will be a new way in which a great deal of research can be done very quickly because of the power of technology and computers. So this feels like it's another revolution that we're going through right now, and I suspect will completely revolutionize whole fields. And as a historian, I think that's obviously terrific, very exciting.
I'm afraid our time is up.
Well, I'll be just 1 minute.
Okay.
Very, very quickly. I just want to come up. So there's a wonderful hadith, مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ دَاءً إِلَّا وَأَنزَلَ اللَّهُ دَوَاءً. So God did not send out a disease without also sending down a cure. And it has spawned a huge tradition. There's one hadith, and it's basically a chapter in these hadith collections. And the idea that basically praying to God cures you. These religious ideas, I think, are very potent in all religions, including Islam, and in this medieval world. So there can be no doubt about it. But what is so remarkable about the medical tradition, which we find here, is that largely these religious aspects do not appear here, and it becomes a scientific religion that transcends these communities, and this is what is so wonderful.
If it's the same hadith, I think that it says there's one disease that can't be cured by prayer or through medicine. And does anybody know what that is? There you go, you see. The perfect way to end. Everyone's shouting. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. We're finishing. I'm going to ask our panellists an incredibly unfair question, just to finish, is that in this room we've been illuminated and enlightened this afternoon. There's always a danger that we keep these kind of conversations within these kinds of rooms. And it feels incredibly important to get this information, these ideas, this kind of discourse out to a much wider world. The knowledge that is contained just within that book is essential knowledge for our times. So remarkably briefly, Peter, I'd like you to just say why this work matters and how we can, all of us, best share it with the world. And I'd like to just ask all of you, just very briefly, a kind of philosophical thought rather than a practical one.
Well, I think it matters hugely because if you think of this tradition, and this is something we haven't touched upon, it is part of our Western, in inverted comma, our Western medical tradition. So in the nascent, in the beginning universities of Europe, and during the Renaissance, the authors that were read, the authors that were taught were largely, not only, but largely Arab and Muslim authors in Latin translation. And so if we really want to understand how the medicine that we do today, how it originated, we need to look back to this tradition. So it is our history, it is not alien. It's not East and West, never the twain shall meet, but this is part of the Western medical tradition. And importantly, when we exclude this from our heritage, when we do not talk about this, this often has to do with a bias, whether conscious or unconscious, against those who are part of that tradition. And these are now, in many countries, we just need to look around here, our fellow citizens, and these are the people with whom we share a space, a culture. So just in general for humanistic reasons, but also for practical reasons, we should really make this tradition ours and tell its story. And this is why it's so important to reach out to a wide audience.
I think there's something very important in these traditions that we haven't really been conversing with about the prevention of disease rather than the trying to fix it. There was a colleague of mine who was the head of NHS sustainability who worked in China, and he said where he worked, people used to pay the doctors so long as they were healthy. Once they got sick, they stopped paying him. So there's a great incentive, and he called the National Health Service the National Disease Service. And I think these ideas of prayer, of meditation, of yoga, of thinking about what you eat as food, as medicine, so there's so much that we could really learn from to make ourselves healthier.
Gosh, well, if I was, I don't think I could say anything as eloquent as my two fellow panellists that won't detract from what they said. I agree, and I couldn't have put it better myself. It turns out that it used to be said that the two certainties in life were death and taxes, and apparently you can beat the tax man, but you've got to move to Monaco or goodness knows where. But healthcare has been something that all of our ancestors, from whichever part of the world, whichever country, whichever region, have all understood that stops all of our loved ones and ourselves from the inevitable. But there's a wonderful text from Tang Dynasty China in the 7th century that says a good doctor shouldn't pay any attention to whether a patient is ugly or beautiful, rich or poor, able to influence their careers or not. All patients should be treated like they're members of a family. And I've never met a doctor in my life who would ever disagree with any of that. And in fact, I've never met a human being who doesn't who would disagree with that. The importance of showing people dignity and respect is something that this book talks of in the terms of medicine, but it's part of a much wider story of how we should treat each other all around the world.
To slightly misquote Wordsworth, he reminds us that although humanity has many faces, we do all share one human heart. And that is something we should never forget. Ladies and gentlemen, please can you put your hands together for our splendid panel this afternoon. Well done.